Can nuclear war get you reelected? In this video, I'm going to take a look at the effect of wars and national security events on the approval ratings and electability of U.S. presidents, looking at data going back to Harry Truman in the 1940s. The question was raised by the Ukraine invasion and the confrontation between the U.S. and Russia over the Ukraine. The invasion was on February 24th, 2022, and I've been wondering, what the effect would be of this invasion and confrontation on President Biden's approval ratings and what's going to happen in the midterm elections in 2022, this year. So far, in the last 3 months, President Biden's approval ratings have continued to decline, as shown here. There's a lot of scatter in these numbers, but they basically appear to be continuing to slowly decline. There's no indication of a dramatic effect on his approval ratings. And I take a look in this video at the effect of various wars and other national security events on the presidential approval ratings and elections all the way back to Truman. The short answer is the effect varies and is unpredictable. So there are a couple of cases where there was a dramatic boost to the president from a national security incident or war. There are also a number of cases where it didn't do anything and appears to have contributed dramatically to the president's longer-term decline in approval and election prospects. So let's take a look at this. First, let me remind people of the 1997 movie, Wag the Dog. The premise of this movie is that the president, who's running for re-election, is facing a major sex scandal, and he brings in a Hollywood producer who's also a campaign contributor, played by Dustin Hoffman, and a kind of murky consultant, played by Robert De Niro. And these guys create a fake war in Albania, which they claim has gotten the atomic bomb, with fake terrorism video produced by Hollywood special effects people and all this kind of stuff. And they managed to divert public attention from the scandal. The country rallies around the president, and he gets reelected. It's a very cynical kind of conspiracy movie, but it does reflect a common conception that wars work and boost the president's popularity. There are many incidents where one wonders if there's some sort of wag the dog strategy being followed by, the real world equivalents of these characters. So what does the historical data for the presidential, I look mostly here at the presidential approval data, and I'll make some comments about the apparent effect on the actual elections of various incidents. The September 11 terrorist attacks, September 11, 2001, almost 3,000 people are killed. This is probably the largest single-day massacre in U.S. history. This produced a very positive effect for President George W. Bush. So you can see here a huge boost in his approval ratings right after the attack. One might wonder why that happens, because you could also say, well, how did you let this happen? Now, he was only president for about 6 months when it happened, but still. We tend not to see that, actually. And it worked very well for the Republicans in 2002, midterm elections, and 2004. Bush was reelected. It started to weigh them down, I would say, in 2006. They lost a lot of seats in the midterm election in 2006, and the Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, resigned. I mean, he was basically fired over, the fact that the Iraq War in particular was dragging on at considerable cost. However, this is probably the most dramatic boost that occurred in history that I was able to look at. Now, FDR got a significant boost. He was already very popular from the Pearl Harbor attack. I think he went from something like maybe 70% approval to 80% approval right after the attack. Again, there was no sort of downshift caused by people asking, well, how did this happen? In FDR's case, he'd been president for a long time, so he couldn't say, well, I'm just the new guy and I inherited this mess from my predecessor. Truman in the Korean War shows virtually no evidence of a benefit from the war. So the war started, according to the historical record, we usually say that it started on June 25th, 1950. That's the red vertical line here. You can see Truman's once high approval was dropping sharply. There's maybe like a tiny bump here for a few months, and then he keeps going way down here. Well, the Korean War did not work to Truman's advantage at all. There's very little evidence of that. It probably contributed to his decline and to the Republican victory in 1952 with Eisenhower. What about the end of the Korean War, which actually happened under Eisenhower? It's usually said to have ended on July 25th, 1953. That's when the armistice is signed. Really doesn't look like it did very much. Eisenhower got the honeymoon boost that most presidents get when their first election, not the second time when they're reelected, but when they first come in, there's usually a large jump up in their approval ratings from their predecessor. So Truman was down here at like 30% of the public approved of his performance. Eisenhower comes in at almost 70% and remains very high. You can't really see any clear effect of the Korean War end, so he was doing well for his first couple of years. Now, a big national security event under Eisenhower was the launch of the Sputnik 1 and 2 satellites by the Soviet Union. These are the first satellites put into Earth orbit by the human race, by the Soviet Union. Sputnik is launched on October 4th, 1957. It's quite small. It can't carry an atomic bomb. But Sputnik 2, which is launched on November 3rd, just a month later, is big, and it could carry an atomic bomb. So this is a big shock to the United States. It's a big news story. It's a political football. It leads to a lot of controversy. What you can see here, though, is it doesn't really have that clear an effect on Eisenhower's approval ratings. He's sort of declining from this very high level here. He's down, and he goes down a little bit more after Sputnik. Maybe he went up, actually, here. And then he rebounds in early 1958 and goes back up. He was a very popular president. He ended his term very popular, didn't run again. And despite massive criticism of Eisenhower and his administration, the 1960 election was very close. Senator Kennedy became President Kennedy. He ran on the missile gap, claiming that the Republicans and Eisenhower and Nixon had dropped the ball and we were way behind the Soviet Union. That does not appear to have been true, and that's what Eisenhower and Nixon claimed at the time. Nonetheless, it looked like we were behind because of this spectacular success with Sputnik, and it was followed by some spectacular failures of attempts by the U.S. to put up their own satellite. We had a couple of them blow up very visibly. They were being covered by TV, and they blew up. So it was very embarrassing. But it was actually a very close election in 1960. A lot of people didn't buy the missile gap. It was decided by a small number of votes, a few tens of thousands in Texas and Chicago, very controversial, a lot of allegations of voting fraud. But the controversy over the missile program and whether we were or weren't behind the Russians, all of this kind of stuff played a big role in why Eisenhower gave this famous farewell address where he popularized or maybe coined the phrase military-industrial complex. Because even though he was a military guy and he was really building up our military capabilities quite a substantial amount, he actually got criticized for not spending enough money on weapons, enough money on nuclear stuff, and for falling behind. Most of that doesn't appear to have been true. Kennedy got a very clear boost from the October 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Soviet Union put nuclear missiles in Cuba for a short period of time. Only lasted a few weeks. He got a huge boost personally, and probably it helped the Democrats in the midterm elections in November of 1962. So this is one of the examples where the crisis or national security event really seems to have helped the president and his political party. Lyndon Johnson took over when Kennedy was assassinated. Again, you can see this big boost right here where occurs with the new president. Kennedy's popularity had dropped to high 50s, and it went up to over almost 80 for LBJ, and it began to decline, and eventually he crashed and burned over the Vietnam War, almost certainly, and other problems. There were massive riots in cities and racial issues and other things, but Vietnam probably took him out. What we can see is the start of the Vietnam War is usually traced U.S. involvement in a major way. The massive escalation of the war is usually credited to the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which led to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. This was in August of 1964 during the presidential election campaign. You can't see any real boost or anything like that from it. In fact, his popularity continues to decline. The interesting thing is Johnson ran as a peace candidate in 1964, painting Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona as a right-wing extremist nutcase warmonger who was going to take the country into war. So the question one comes up with is, well, did they maybe sort of hype this incident to sort of make the public nervous and then paradoxically run successfully on a peace platform? And Goldwater was totally destroyed. It was a landslide election for Johnson in 1964. We don't really know, but it's an interesting and complicated case. And again, you cannot see any real boost in Johnson's popularity, which was very high, due to the Gulf of Tonkin incident or the resolution or the start of the war. The end of the Vietnam War took place under Gerald Ford. And you can see he also gets a big boost over Nixon. Nixon was very unpopular, or his approval rating was very low due to the Watergate scandal, and he resigned. Ford comes in, and again he gets this honeymoon thing where he gets 70% approval, and it rapidly declines. Vietnam War ends in a debacle, actually, on April 30th, 1975. So the communists take over the entire country. But you see what looks like a significant boost in his approval ratings from the end of the war. Another incident that I remember from being a teenager was the Iran hostage crisis. And this started in November of 1979. So President Carter's approval rating was very poor. It had gotten down to around 30. And he got a huge boost initially from the seizure of the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, in Iran. What were described as radical students or activists took over the embassy, held hostage the staff, I think around 60 people or so, for 444 days. They weren't released until right after Reagan took over. Initially, for about 4 or 5 months, this actually clearly boosted Carter's popularity. Again, you can see this rally around the president effect here. You don't always see it, as noted previously. But then it began to weigh the guy down, and it probably contributed significantly to his loss to Ronald Reagan in 1980. What about the first Iraq War under George Herbert Walker Bush? This is kind of interesting because it's not much of a clear boost here from the start of the war, maybe a little bit. But his popularity came out of the war really popular, way over 80. This is one of the highest ratings for a president, and then rapidly declined and lost to Clinton in 1992. So it didn't really translate into electoral victory just a year or so later. Again, the effect of the wars is very unpredictable. Here we can see maybe a little boost, and then it goes down significantly during the war, and then at the end of the war, with victory, he's doing pretty good, and that rapidly decays away. And going back to President Biden and the Ukraine situation again, there's absolutely no sign here. His popularity has been declining over the last 3-4 months. Record lows, actually. So we're a little bit past here. I think we're somewhere up here now, but there's been more polls since this plot was produced. Again, there's no indication that it's working for him. In conclusion, despite the folk tradition epitomized by Wag the Dog, another movie, the reality is wars and national security events have unpredictable effects on presidents. There are examples of dramatic boosts. There's several cases where, such as Korea, for example, for Truman, where they appear to have had a pretty negative effect, nothing really positive in the short term and a disaster in the long term. The lesson for policymakers is probably to avoid wars and focus on resolving substantive domestic economic problems and other domestic issues. This concludes this video presentation. If you like this video, please click like. Please click subscribe and the notification bell if you would like to receive more content from us.
You can avoid internet censorship by subscribing directly to our RSS news feed. Please consider sharing the link by email and on your website or blog, in addition to liking, upvoting, or sharing on increasingly censored, advertising beholden, big company social media. We have encountered such censorship. Mathematical software is developing algorithms and software to automate data analysis, reducing the risks of costly errors and increasing the predictive power of the results. You can support our work financially by subscribing on our Patreon page, https://www.patreon.com/mathsoft, or scanning the QR code in the lower right corner.